Hey everyone, so this is the Next.js tutorial that I promised. Now Next.js is a React framework that allows us to do a lot of things such as server-side rendering, which I've got a video on linked below, and other things too like static site generation and code splitting. It takes a lot of that heavy lifting and handles it for us so that we don't have to worry about it. Now, as I said, it's a React framework, so that means you need to be familiar with React in order to follow along with this tutorial. Now, don't worry, I've got tons of React videos ranging all the way from beginner to advanced. I'll link some of those in the description as well. Now, I'm about to demo what it is we're gonna be building, but first, please go ahead and smash the like button for me, subscribe if you haven't already. I'm gonna go ahead and get this ready. All right, everyone, so this is what we're gonna be building in this tutorial. So as you can see, we're on the home page right now. And if I click the feed, you can see that it takes me to a news feed with a bunch of different articles. Now, if I were to scroll through this, you can see the different articles. Each one has a title, a description, and an image. If I were to click on the title, it actually takes me to the article itself. So we're retrieving these from an API. The API that we're using is called News API, and we're gonna sign up for that in just a moment. Don't worry, it's entirely free. You don't have to enter any credit card information whatsoever, so don't worry about that. So the second thing I wanna show you about this news feed is that in the URL here, you probably can't see it, so I'll read it out loud. The URL is /feed/1. Now that 1 represents what page we're on. So if we scroll all the way to the bottom here, you can see that it says number 1, which is also representative of the page we're currently on. So I can click next page and it takes me to page 2 and the URL updates to represent that as well. And we have new articles. We can go to page 3, etc. We're going to be able to go all the way to page 5. Now this is interesting as well because I can come up to the URL and type in 4 and it takes me to the 4th page here, which is also represented correctly right here on the bottom. Now, because this is server-side rendering, if I were to share this URL on social media such as Facebook or Twitter, it's going to represent the articles that are actually loaded from the API on the particular preview that we share. I'll show you what I mean by that because we are going to be deploying this app in this tutorial. So I'll show you actually what that looks like. In other words, if I were to share page 4 on Facebook, it's going to show the actual articles in the preview for page 4, or at least the first one. And that is due to server-side rendering. All right, so let's look at the third tab, EOM. That stands for Employee of the Month. Now I've put myself on here because I just didn't want to use anybody else's information, but you can obviously put anybody you want here. We're gonna go through this in the tutorial. But the reason why this page exists is because I, again, want to demonstrate the ability to server-side render data. We're actually gonna be retrieving this information from a database. In fact, we're going to be using GitHub for the database. I'll show you all that in the tutorial, don't worry. But this is going to be really helpful to demonstrate how we can share a URL and gather the information on the server side and have the actual Facebook or Twitter bot parse that and actually show it in the preview. In a React application, this would not work like that. So in a Next.js server-side application, this is going to work, but in a standard single-page application in React without server-side rendering, you would not get that preview. And we'll show that, once we get there. Twitter, this is just a URL to my Twitter. You can put your own Twitter, of course, but I just wanted to have 4 tabs. I thought it looked nice. So let's go ahead and dig into this tutorial. All right, so the first thing you're gonna wanna do is go to newsapi.org. Go ahead and sign up, get your API key. Again, you don't have to type in any sort of payment information. Go ahead and sign up, get that API key. And once you've got that, we can actually begin integrating our News API into our app, but you have to have this first. So I figure let's go ahead and knock this out. So if I click my username here, you can actually see that I've got this all set up already. And this is the API key here. So once you sign up, just go ahead and take your API key and keep this open in the browser, maybe pin the tab, just make sure you have access to this at all times. And we'll use this a little bit later. So go ahead and sign up and get that knocked out. Okay, so I'm gonna assume you went ahead and signed up for the News API. Now, I'm assuming also that you have NPM and Node.js installed. Since, like I said before, it's kind of a tutorial where I'm assuming you already have learned React and you're familiar with React. That means you probably have NPM and Node.js installed. If you don't, go ahead and install that, look it up, knock that out, and then come back. But I'm going to assume you already have it. So I'm going to show you what versions I have. Node-V. I'm on version 15. You don't have to be on version 15. You can have any version as long as it's Node.js 10.13 or later. So use any version you want, but I'm going to use 15 for this tutorial. And if I do nvm-v, you can also, whoops, my apologies, npm-v, you can see that I'm on version 7.0.2. As long as you have a late enough version of NPM to use NPX, then this will work out for you just perfectly fine. So in order to initialize our Next.js application, I'm going to use npx, and I'm going to say npx create next app, and a space followed by the name of the app, and that's going to be called Next News. And when I press enter, it's going to bring me through a setup process for this Next.js application. All right, so on your end, it might look a little bit different if it's your first time ever setting up a Next.js app. It's probably going to ask you a few questions, just go through the prompts. In my case, it didn't. It just went ahead and created it. So I'm going to cd into the directory, and I'm going to open it up in my code editor, and I'm going to be using VS Code for this tutorial. Use any code editor you're familiar with and comfortable with. So what I want to do is take a look through this directory and explain kind of everything that was generated for us, okay? So the first thing I want to start with, obviously, is the package JSON, just to see what dependencies we have. Now we have Next.js, and we have React and React DOM. So obviously, since this is a React framework, it's going to have to include React and React DOM for us. Now we have 3 run commands. So normally in a React application, if you're using create React app, you're probably going to run a command such as npm start in order to run the server on the dev side. But in our case here, we're going to be running a command called dev. So we're going to say npm run dev whenever we want to run this project. So speaking of that, I'm going to go ahead and run npm run dev just to show you what pops up on the screen on our boilerplate project that our create next app created for us. You can see that it says started server on localhost 3000. So I'll run over to that. It basically created a boilerplate project for us with some links and all that good stuff, but we're going to knock all that out. We're going to get rid of it and create our own stuff. But yeah, it's just kind of cool to see that this was created for us. And you can see it says get started by editing pages/index.js. So let's hop into the project and have a look at that file that it's asking us to look at, pages/index.js. So what is going on in here? So this should look pretty familiar to you if you are used to React, because this is literally just your standard React code. There's nothing about this component that is anything different than what you would expect in a standard React application. So that's good. That means you can write your standard React code. You don't really have to worry about learning much new stuff. It's pretty simple. Next.js handles so much stuff for you. If you already know React, this is going to be super easy for you. We're going to get rid of all of this and write our own code. So I'm going to get rid of our return statement here and instead just return a simple fragment that says hello world. And I'm going to save it and go back just to see that it did in fact update with hello world inside of the window. Now let's take a look at some of the other boilerplate code that's included in the project and talk about it. We have this _ app.js file. Now what this basically is it's provided by Next.js. You pretty much don't have to edit this, but you can. But it's sort of like a higher order component that helps initialize the pages, and it's kind of just used by the framework itself. Now you can edit this, you can modify it in more advanced use cases. For instance, if you want to share state between pages, but in this tutorial, we're not going to edit this page whatsoever. All right, moving on to the API folder. As you can see inside of the API folder, we have a hello.js file. Let's take a look. Now, if you're familiar at all with Node.js and Express.js, you might realize that this kind of looks like an Express.js API function, and it really kind of is. This API folder allows us to, right out of the box, write serverless functions, meaning that we can write API endpoint functions within our actual Next.js project as if it were front-end code and call them from our front end. But if we deploy it to a server like Vercel, which I'm going to in this video, you can call them as if they're backend functions, and they'll actually run on a server that is handled by Vercel. And on our dev environment, it's actually handled to work right out of the box as well. So if I were to run this via npm run dev, these serverless functions would actually be running. So that's super helpful. We're not going to use these in this tutorial since this is a beginner Next.js tutorial. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this API folder, but keep that in mind because that is insanely helpful in a lot of different use cases. All right, and then we have the public folder. Now, if you look inside of this public folder, you may say, hey, this is different than a React application. In fact, it is, because in a React application, standard React single page application, what you would expect to see inside of here is an index.html file where we would be injecting our components into that HTML file and serving that. However, that does not exist in here. And that's because instead of serving a single HTML file that we inject code into and serve to the client, we're actually going to have different pages for every single page in a Next.js application. So in the home page, for example, that you already saw, we have the index.js file. But if we wanted to create a new page, for example, the employee of the month page that you saw earlier on, we would actually create an eom.js file, which would represent that route. eom.js would represent the eom page. And don't worry, we're going to be creating pages in this tutorial, but for now, I just want to take one more look at something. We have a styles folder. Now there is a globals.css file where you can put all of your global CSS, and that is going to be imported. It's already imported inside of our underscore app.js file that is right here. You can see the import is on the first line, styles global CSS. So this is what I was talking about, shared state among pages. We share the global CSS among all pages, so it's imported in this app.js file. And then we have component and page specific CSS that we're using CSS modules for. And if you're familiar with Create React App, it's going to be pretty much the exact same thing. You can create a class like this and then import this CSS module into your component or page, and then reference it by saying styles.container. And then that way it'll be containerized to that specific component and will not leak to other classes, and styles will not just leak into other components and that sort of thing. So CSS modules is available here. Now in the pattern of Create React App, they have all of their CSS modules in a single styles folder. That's a little bit different than what I normally do. I normally take the CSS and include them in the component or the page, I guess you could say, in Next.js, the component folder. So inside of here, maybe I would have a different folder for every single page, and that folder would contain the page itself and also a CSS module. But since that's not the pattern here for the Create Next app generated code, I'm going to follow the pattern that it created for us. So I'm going to put all of my styles inside of this styles folder and import it from there. So let's go ahead and begin actually creating some files. Now, if you're not familiar with why you would use Next.js over something like standard React, please do take a look in the description at the video that is titled "What is Server-Side Rendering?" because you're going to want to understand what the benefit of server-side rendering is if you don't already. Otherwise, you might as well just use React. But if you understand the benefits behind using a technology such as Next.js, you'll highly benefit from it. So go ahead and watch that if you haven't already. And I'm going to go ahead and get started with some pages. Now, if you remember in that header, when I was demoing the app, there was 3 pages and 1 link. The link was to Twitter, so we don't have to create a page for that. But there were 2 pages. There was feed and there was EOM, which is Employee of the Month. We're going to start with the EOM page because that's going to be the easiest. And then we'll move on to the feed afterwards. Now we're going to just be writing basically a standard React component. So if you're familiar with creating React function components, this is going to be very simple for you. The only difference is we're going to have to make sure that it's a default export. So that's really the only difference. So let's say export const, and I'll call this EOM and set that equal to a function. And below the function, we have to export default EOM. So it has to be a default export for the pages for Next.js to be able to import these pages and serve them properly. So let's start by going ahead and creating a div that we're going to return inside of our component. And this div should have a class name. We're going to give this component a class name of page container. Now we don't have this class yet. We'll add it in just a moment, and we're going to make it a global style. And since it's a global style, I don't have to use the styles dot syntax. I can just use a standard string because it's not going to be locked down to a specific component. So I can use this class name just like that. Now, the first thing that we're going to want to put inside of here is another div, which is going to be the container that is for the page itself and all the main content. Now, at the top of this, we can put an employee of the month header and save it. And let's go back to our browser and actually go to the /EOM page, click enter. And now you can see that you see the EOM Employee of the Month page. What's super convenient about this is that we didn't have to add this anywhere. Next.js actually automatically picked up on the fact that there was a new page that we added because we added it inside of the pages folder, and it picked up on that and is serving that for us. So it makes it super easy for us to just create new pages. Now, this is pretty cool and all, but we're gonna wanna actually have a Employee of the Month. And since it's gonna change every single month, we wanna get this from a database, and we don't want to hard code this and push a update to the application every single time we change some data here. So in order to do that, we're going to use the MyJSON server API. Now I've already got an endpoint set up for you, so you don't have to set up anything on your end unless you want to. You can totally set up your own db.json file. That's perfectly fine. But in our case here, if you just want to follow along, just use the URL that I'm going to be using in this tutorial. Now, in order to do this, since we want to make sure that all bots and all social media platforms and everything can render this data instead of just the raw skeleton, we're going to want to make sure that we server-side render this page. So if we server-side render this page, then always what's going to happen is when it gets to the client, it's going to be fully populated already. So if any search bots such as Google or social media platform bots were to parse this page, the data would be inside of it. And that is what we want here. So how exactly can we do server-side rendering? Well, as I said, Next.js makes it super easy for us to do server-side rendering. Super easy. So all we have to do is wherever we want to do any sort of server-side rendering in any page that we may have, we just go below the export function, so below the component code itself, right here on line 11 in my case, and we're going to create and export a new function that we have to name get server-side props. So get server-side props. And this is a function that we're going to make asynchronous. So put your async keyword there, and it's going to take in a page context, which is actually provided automatically by Next.js. And all of the code that we put inside of here, we can run asynchronously on the server. So we can go out to the database, get some data all on the server, and then pass it into our component as if it were props. So that means we can, inside of this server-side props function, go and grab the employee of the month and then pass it into this component as a prop, which means that this component can now take a prop called employee that we're going to pass in from this function. So all we really have to do is just fetch that data like we normally would on a client-side application. So let's do that. Let's say const API response is equal to await. So we'll use await here, and then we'll just simply use the fetch API to call the URL. This is the URL we want to call. Now this endpoint is literally just a endpoint to my GitHub repo through a API service that is going to find a file that I created called db.json that contains an employee of the month object. So here on my GitHub, this is the repository for this tutorial code. I can scroll down and see that I've committed a file called db.json, and I just have an object in here called employee of the month. And the value is name port exe, position software engineer, an image to my profile image, and then a small description. This is super convenient because it allows me to have a mock database without actually having to set up a database. You really don't have to worry about how all of this is happening. I'm just explaining it so that you don't think this is magic. I wanted you to understand it so that you can fully understand how we're doing this and you can change it on your own end as well. And again, you can commit your own db.json file and use your own data, but if you just want to follow along, please just use the URL that I've got right here. So as you can see, we went ahead and fetched the API response, but we have to convert it to JSON. So let's create a const employee and set it equal to await API response.json, because the JSON function of what's returned from this fetch is asynchronous as well. So calling this code basically takes the response, parses out the body, and turns it into JSON. Now all we have to do is return this object, basically return it in such a way that this component can parse out that prop. All we have to do is return an object with a property called props, and then any props that we want to provide to this component, we can put inside of this props object. Now, all we want for this component is an employee object. So let's go ahead and create an employee object and set that obviously equal to employee because we have it right here. Now in JavaScript, you don't actually have to add this second colon and employee since it is the same name. We can just create shorthand here just like this and save it. And now we're returning an object with props inside of it and the employee object. But I want to see what this looks like in the context of a actual component here on the browser. So to do that, I'm just going to console.log employee to see what this looks like. Then go to my browser, go back to the application, make sure that I'm on the EOM page, right click inspect, go to the console and see that right now it's undefined. Now, the thing is, when you're working with Next.js, since there is a server-side aspect for it, sometimes when you're wanting to make updates, you're gonna want to make sure that you refresh on the browser. So if you click refresh, now you can see that you're getting the data from the database. You're actually getting that employee object from the server-side render. But also, if you go to your console, you can see that it's logging here as well. So it's logging in the browser, it's logging that employee object, and it's also logging that employee object object in the server. So what that means is this is isomorphic JavaScript that we've written that is running on both the server and the client, meaning that this is running once on the server, it's getting served to the browser, and then it's running again in the browser. So just keep that in mind. And if you're unfamiliar with what isomorphic JavaScript is, I've got a video on that as well, and I explain it in like 3 minutes. So you may want to check that out if you need to. But this is pretty cool because now we have this employee object that we're getting from a database. Let's go ahead and display the information that we want to display for a given employee of the month. So pulling open my code, I'm going to go underneath my h1 tag and create a new div, and inside of here an h3 with the employee name. Now, this is just standard JSX for React here. So employee, since we have that object, employee.name, and we can go underneath this, and I'm gonna do an h6 to have the position, the position of the employee. So employee.position. And again, if you want to just take a look and see what pieces are available, we're already logging it. You can see description, image, name, and position are what we can access. So we need to get the description and image now. Let's go ahead and hop in here. Underneath the position, let's add an image tag and set the source equal to employee.image. And then finally, underneath that, we're gonna go ahead and create a paragraph tag with the description for the employee. Save it, and let's have a look. So as you can see, this information has been served to the browser as expected. It doesn't look very good. We'll add the CSS in a second, but I wanna show you something interesting, which is that if we right click inside of here, go to view page source, if I search inside of here for the image tag, you can see that the image tag exists in the page source itself. We actually have this, it's right here, you can see it, it's in the page source. What happens if we're not server-side rendering this application? What happens if we're doing all of this logic on the front end like we would be in the case of a standard React application? Well, if we were rendering this all on the front end, if we were to view the page source of this, just like we did here, what we would end up seeing instead is just a raw, empty skeleton. We wouldn't see any of that information inside of there. That is what's making this server-side rendering so powerful right now. And that's just due to the fact that in a standard single page application, you're loading in the skeleton from the server, and then you're loading the JavaScript, and then you're injecting everything on the browser instead of on the server. All right, let's go ahead and make this page look a little prettier. So let's jump over to our code and go to our styles folder on the left, and let's create a new file, I apologize, called EOM. I'm using all caps here, .module.css. And inside of here is where we're gonna put our CSS for this particular page. So we're gonna create a main class. We're gonna use flex1 because we're gonna have that page container that we already added for the class name and the globals. We're gonna add that in the globals in a second, but it's gonna be flexbox. So we're gonna make the main flexbox as well. So display flex, align items should be center. And we're going to also set the flex direction to column. And let's set the margin top to 50 pixels. We also want to have an employee of the month class, and we're just gonna set the text align to center here. And finally, let's go ahead and target the image inside of the employee of the month. So we'll target the image here, and we wanna set the width to be hard-coded to 250 pixels and set the border radius to 100% to make it circular. But we have to actually import this into our eom.js file in order to have access to these styles. So let's import it like this. It's going to be a default import, so import styles from, and we'll use a relative path here. So /styles/eom.module.css. And now that we have access to this styles object here that we're importing from our CSS module, we can go ahead and begin adding our classes. And we're gonna want to add them inside just like we would with a normal React application. So let's start with this div right here and give this a class name of styles.main. I'm gonna copy this to make it easier for the other ones. Inside of this div, I'm going to give it a class name of styles.employee of the month. Let's save it and see what this looks like. Okay, looks pretty good. However, let's go ahead and hop into our global CSS and add our page container class. So on the left, go over to your styles folder and open up globals.css, go to the bottom and create a page container class that has a display of flex, a height of 100 view height, and a flex direction of column. That looks like it's pretty much it for our EOM page. There's really nothing else we need to add here other than the fact that we're missing the toolbar, but we're gonna create a shared component for that we we can share among all of the pages. We'll do that in just a moment. But before we knock that out, we might as well go ahead and set up our home page. So let's go ahead and set up our home page. Back in the code editor, I'm going to close out all the tabs that I have open so far and go to my index.js file because that's where our home page lives. And we're going to follow the same pattern by having a div in here with a class name of page container. And that is going to be from the globals, so we don't have to import it specifically and we don't have to use the CSS modules syntax. We can just have a normal string. So let's go ahead and create a div inside of here with a class name of styles.main. Now, we don't have this main class yet. We'll add it in just a moment. We're already importing the home.module.css, so it'll be just as simple as going into that file and adding the class name. Inside of here, we'll have a h1 tag that just says Next.js news app. And below this, we'll have an h3 tag with a message in it that just says you are one-stop shop for the latest news articles. So go ahead and save that, and let's head over to our styles page, which is inside of our styles folder, and we have the home.modules.css right here. And as you can see, there's a bunch of stuff in here already that was generated by Next.js. I'm just gonna Control A and delete all of that so it's empty. And I want to add a main class with a flex of 1. I want to set the display to flex. I want to set align items to center so that it's vertically centered. And I want to set the flex direction to column. So actually align items becomes the opposite in this case and makes it centered horizontally, but we do want it centered vertically as well. So let's go ahead and set justify content to center as well. But let's also target the h1 inside of the main class and set the margin top to -50 pixels. And that is just due to the fact that the toolbar that we're going to be adding is going to have a margin of 50 pixels. And we want it to look nice and centered. So once we add this, it's going to ignore that margin top of 50 pixels, basically. Don't worry about that now. Just make sure that you add it and you'll see that aesthetic difference a little bit later. So you can see that we have this nice and centered. It looks pretty good, but let's go ahead and add our toolbar so that we can go between the home page and the EOM page. Now, luckily for us, this is going to be very much just plain React code. In fact, what we're about to write could almost, not quite, but almost be shared between a Next.js and a React app. The only difference is that we're going to be using the Next.js router instead of React router DOM that we would normally use in a standard single page React application. So outside of all of these folders in your root part of the folder, go ahead and create a components directory. And inside of here, we're going to create a file called toolbar.js. And this is where we're going to have our toolbar component. So let's go ahead and start our toolbar component by exporting a function. So export const toolbar, and it's not going to take any props. And since this is a standard React component and not a Next.js page, notice the difference between the two. This is a standard component. We don't have to do a default export. We can just export it like this. But what do we need to do inside of here? Well, the first thing we're going to have to do is think about the fact that we need to be able to route between pages. So there is a router that's provided to us by Next.js, and that is imported as use router from next/router. So go ahead and import that. And then that's actually a hook that we can use and set to a variable just like this. So I'm creating a variable here called router and setting it equal to use router. And now we have access to the Next.js router and can use it pretty much just like a standard function. So let's go ahead and return some JSX inside of here. And we're going to follow the same kind of naming conventions for our class names. And by that, I mean, we're going to use styles.main for the main div here. But of course, we do not have the toolbar styles yet. So jump over to your styles, create a new file, toolbar.module.css. And in here, I'm just going to put the following CSS. We're going to have a main class with a width of 100%, a height of 50 pixels, a display of flex, and we're going to center that vertically by using justify content center. Then we're going to target divs inside of that and set the margin for each div inside of the main class to 25 pixels and set the cursor to be a pointer instead of the little arrow. Then on hover, we want it to turn gray just so that there's some sort of effect that shows, hey, you can interact with this div. And the divs are going to end up being the links. So go ahead and add this CSS to your toolbar.module.css file. And then you have to make sure that you import that file as well inside of your component, just like you do in the other ones. So go ahead and import styles, default import from, and then use your /styles. And then the name of the file. And now that we have that, we can have access to that main class. So inside of here, we're going to have several divs, and each div is going to represent a link in that toolbar. And if you remember, there was 4 total. The first one was the home, and I'm gonna copy this and paste it 4 times. The second one was the feed. The third one was EOM, and then the last one was Twitter. For the first 3, we're gonna use the Next.js router when you click on it. And for the 4th one, we're just going to literally redirect them to mine or your Twitter page. So we need to add an on-click function to each of these divs. And what do we want to do when we click on, say, the home page? Well, we want to router.push, and the route that we want to go to when we click home is just the /root. So if I click on that, it's going to take me just to the standard base URL. And I will copy this and paste this into the feed div, but instead of the /route, we were going to want to go to the feed route. Now, what's different about the feed route, which we have not created the page for yet, is the fact that it's going to take another parameter, and that is the page number. So by default, when we click on the feed URL, we want to go to the first page. So I'm putting /feed/1. Now let's go to the EOM, paste that in. Obviously for this, we're going to want to go to /EOM. And finally for Twitter, if I paste this in, instead of doing router.push, let's just manipulate the actual URL. So I can say window, let's access the window object, window.location.href. We can set that URL to any hard-coded URL you want. In my case, I'm going to do https://twitter.com/portexe. And now I've saved that, and we're pretty much done with our toolbar component here. Which means since we're done with that component, we can start putting it inside of our pages. So go to your pages, let's start with the home page, and here inside of page container, but outside of main, so between these 2 divs right here, let's throw in our toolbar. And for me, it went ahead and auto imported it, but you'll wanna make sure that it's imported here, and it's a non-default export, because we're not exporting it as a default, and we are importing it from components toolbar. So just make sure you're importing that and that you have it in between these 2 divs. Let's save it and go to the home page and see what we have. As you can see here, we have a toolbar with the homepage. What happens if I click Employee of the Month? If I click that, it in fact takes me to my Employee of the Month page that we've created. So we know it's working good. The only problem is, where's the toolbar? Well, we need to add that toolbar to our EOM page as well. So hop into your EOM page here. In fact, I'm just gonna copy this import line and go into my EOM page and just paste that here. And also copy the toolbar here and paste it between the page container and the main, just like the other component as well. And as you can see, now I can go between the home page and the Employee of the Month page using the toolbar. Let's test out our Twitter URL. So if I click that, it takes me to my Twitter. So we have all of the toolbar items working other than the feed. And that's going to be the most important part since this is a news app. Let's go ahead and work on the feed component now. If I click it, you can see what it says is 404. This page could not be found. So it handles 404s for us automatically, which is great. You can see that the URL is /feed/1. Let's go ahead and talk about this for a second, because the other components, we created pages like this. We created a page called EOM, and we're not expecting any sort of extra parameters such as /1 or /anything else, /January, /February. We're not expecting any sort of extra parameters. So we've created a file that represents the actual name of the path. So how could we create a page that could be different depending on a parameter? For example, feed/1 is page 1 and will contain different data than say feed/2. How can we do that? Next.js again makes it super simple for us to do that. So instead of creating a simple file, we're going to create a folder, and it's going to be called feed. Now feed is going to represent that particular piece of the URL. Since it's /feed/1 or /feed/2, etc. Inside of the feed folder, we're going to create a new file, which is going to take 2 square brackets, and then we can put in a name of a variable here. In my case, I'm going to call it slug. You don't have to call it slug. You could call it like page ID or something like that, but I'm going to call it slug.js. And what's going to happen is we're going to be able to create our page, our feed page inside of this, just like we would with any other of the pages, but it's going to be a dynamic route now. So to build this component, I'm going to start by just knocking out some boilerplate, and then we're going to work on some server-side rendering stuff. So export const feed is equal to a function, and then inside of here, I'm going to return some very basic JSX, which is just a React fragment that says hello world, and make sure that you export it as a default. So export default feed. Now I'm going to save this, and I want to see what happens when I go to my page here. Let's refresh, and we can see that nothing's happening. That's because we have to have a parameter here. If we wanted to have a, say, like a feed, and then also be able to have feed 1 and feed 2, feed 3, then we would have to go into our pages and then outside of the feed folder, create a feed.js. But in our case, we only want to go to the feed route if we have this second page parameter here. So if I go to feed/1, now it loads hello world here, and it does not care which page we're on. So now I'm on feed 14. It doesn't care. It has no idea. It does not care about that second parameter. That's because what we're going to do is we're going to take and parse out that second parameter, get the data from the API, and then populate it inside of our component here on the server side, which means that this is going to end up taking a couple of props. It's going to take a page number prop and a articles prop. And we're going to grab the page number from the URL, and we're going to grab articles based on that page number from the news API on the server side, and then pass it into this component as props. We are going to need to create our get server side props function. So export const get server side props, and it's going to be an asynchronous function. Again, it takes the page context, and it is a function that we are going to use to gather some data asynchronously and render on the server. So the first thing we want to do is get the page number, which is actually in the URL that the browser's requesting. So we can grab that from our page context that we're getting passed in automatically from Next.js. So let's create a variable called page number and set it equal to page context dot query dot slug. Now, query is going to be an object that contains this slug property. And the reason why it's called slug is because I named this file slug in square brackets. If I would have named this, say, PID for page ID, then this would be PID instead. So if you named this something other than slug, make sure that you reference that correctly here. If we don't have a page number, or if page number is for some reason less than 1, in other words, we don't want any negative page numbers or a 0 page number, or if page number is greater than 5, then we don't really want to send any props because we don't want to get anything from the API if it's page 0 or if it's anything greater than page 5, because that's just how the application is going to be working. So in that case, let's return an object to our component with props. Let's just set articles to an empty array, and let's set page number to 1. Now, if that's not the case, if we have the correct page number that we would expect, let's go ahead and call our API. Now, this is what I'm doing here. I'm creating an API response variable that I'm setting equal to whatever this fetch returns. What are we fetching? Well, in my case here, I have the URL that is the following: newsapi.org/v2/top headlines. Now for country, I'm in the United States, so I'm using country equals US. And if you are outside of the country, you can go to their docs and see what countries they support. Otherwise, you can just use US for the tutorial. I'm adding the and symbol here, and the page size I want to be 5. So that means 5 articles per page. And the page number is this page query parameter here. I'm dynamically setting to the page number that we are getting from the URL. So if this is page 4, then this value here will be 4 as well. And that's all inside of the URL. Now notice something is I've got this headers and we're setting authorization. That's because we need to have our private key, our API key, inside of our header. Now, since this is being run on the server, we don't have to actually worry about our key being exposed to the browser. In other words, we don't really have to worry about people seeing our key, but we don't want to commit this to source code, because if we commit it to source code, then anybody can, if this is public, can see that. So what I'm doing here is I'm setting the authorization header to bearer, and then I'm pulling the value from an environment variable. So let's go ahead and add this environment variable so that we don't expose this to the public. So to do this, first, you're going to want to run over to your gitignore file, and you're going to see a list of .env files here. At the top, I'm just going to add one more that's just literally .env, and that's it. That way it ignores our environment variable file and does not commit that to our GitHub, which we're going to add it to later. So go ahead and add that. And then inside of your root directory, create a new file, and it's going to be called .env. And inside of here, create a new env var called next public news key. And you're going to want to set it equal to your API key. So go to your project, go to your API key, copy that and paste it in after this equal sign right here. So it'll look something like that. So just go ahead and do that. I'm not going to show you mine because I don't want to expose it, but just go ahead and do that really quick. Once you've saved that and you've closed that file, when we run our process, when we run our dev server, it's going to load that .env file automatically. And now this will be that API key. So this will end up being that API key. So this request should work for you. But in order to get it to work, we have to restart our server. So go to wherever you're running your server, close it out. I used Control-C to close it out and run npm run dev again, just to get this thing running. Now it's running on my local host and that is great. It should now be loading the env var. So I'm going to refresh because I just want to make sure that the server side code is refreshed as well. Just something that I like to do. So we have this API response and we have the correct header and we have the correct URL and we're fetching it, but we need to convert it to JSON. So const API JSON is equal to await, and we're going to take the API response and call the JSON function on it. So now we have the API JSON, but what does this object look like? Well, in order to demonstrate that, we can simply log console.log API JSON. So I'm going to log this and pull open my my terminal here and get ready to look at this, but I have to quickly go to here. I'm going to go to page, let's say page 3, because we can't be above page 5 because we have that if statement that blocks us from doing that. Go to page 3 and click enter. You're going to get an error. That's fine. Just go over to your terminal window and see what it logs. It logs an array of objects, and this object, each object is an article. And this array of articles belongs to a property called articles on the object API JSON. So since we're logging API JSON, we can grab all of the articles by saying API JSON.articles. But I'm going to use destructuring assignment to grab it instead of doing it that way, which just looks like this. Const articles is equal to API JSON. I just think that looks a little bit cleaner. Sorry, there should not be parentheses there. Const articles equals API JSON. So now we're pulling the articles out. We have that array of articles. We want to go ahead and give that to our component because it's expecting those as props. So let's do that. Let's return an object. And this object has a property called props. And we want it to pass two things to it, if you remember, page number and articles. We already have both of these. We have page number here at the top and we have article. So it's very simple. We just go ahead and return both of those inside of this object. So articles, and we want to return page number, but let's actually make it an actual number because right now when we pull it from the URL, it's actually a string, but let's go ahead and convert that to a number so that our component inside of the browser has access to the raw number instead. So number.parseInt page number, go ahead and save that and let's refresh. And now we don't get that error. Let's go up to our component and log articles. And let's also log page number. So I'm logging both article and page number inside of my feed component, which means I should be able to see these logs inside of the component. And in fact, I do. Page number is 3, which it is in my case. And if I go and open up this articles array, I can see the data for all of the articles for page 3 from my news API. So what that basically means for us is we can go ahead and begin displaying all of this data on our newsfeed. So let's go to our component here and begin writing our actual feed component. So inside of the return, I'm going to open it up and follow the standard pattern of a div with a class name of styles.main. And inside of here, I want to loop through our articles. I want to map through our articles and map each article to a div with some stuff inside of it. So to do that, I'm going to open up my curly braces. This is just standard React stuff. Articles.map, and I'm going to map each one of these to a div. So we should take both of the, we'll say article, and we need to access the index because each time we map through a list of something and map it to a div, it needs to have a key, and we're going to use the index for that key. So we're going to map each one to a div. And like I said, it's going to take a key, which I'm going to set equal to index so that React is happy. And I'm going to give it a class name of styles.post. And we have not added these classes yet, so don't worry, just add it now and we'll get to that in a moment. Inside of this div, we want to add a couple of things. We want to add an H1, and this H1 is going to contain the title. So article.title. I just want to see what this looks like now. So I'm going to save it and go into here, and we can see I'm already getting an error, and that's because I'm not importing the styles yet. So let's go ahead and actually just create our styles file. We'll populate the file a little bit later, but go ahead and go to your styles folder and create a feed.module.css. And I'm just going to close it out and import it so that I don't get that error in it. So import styles from feed.module.css. Save, and I refresh, and I don't get that error anymore. And I see all of the 5 different titles for the articles for page 3. If I were to change this URL to page 1, you'll see that we get different articles. So we know that the page number is working. So we want to make sure that we have other information than just the titles, obviously. So let's hop below this H1 where we're putting the title and throw a paragraph tag in here and some curly braces, and throw an article.description. And then below that, we'll go ahead and add the image, but we only want to add the image if the image exists. And there might be cases where there'll be an article, but there's no image for it. So what I'm doing here is I'm just checking to make sure that the image exists. And if it does, I'm loading an image tag with the source equal to article.url to image. Save this. Let's have a look at what we have here. So now we have the information we would expect to see, but it's kind of large. I don't really want to see it this large. I want it to look better. So that's just as simple as going in and adding the styles. So let's quickly add our styles. So heading over to the styles folder, we just created that feed.module.css. I'm pasting in my styles. I'm going to go over it really quick. So we have the main, pretty standard with the rest of the components. Then we have the post, and each post is going to have a width of 500 pixels, a margin top and a margin bottom of 25 pixels, and a border bottom of 1 pixel solid black. We target the image inside of the post and set the width to 100%. We target the H1 inside of the post, set the font size to 16, the cursor to pointer, and the text align to center. Save this and let's see what it looks like. This looks way better. This looks totally presentable. Now, this isn't, a really good news app because I can't go to the actual news article. I'm clicking this and nothing's happening. That's because we have to add an on-click event for the actual title, because when we click on the title, we want to go to the news article itself. So going back to my feed component, where the title is, I'm going to add this on-click function, which just takes it sets the window.location.href equal to the article.url. So it takes that article URL and sets it to the on-click target. And when I refresh inside of here, you can see that Dow drops over 500 points. That's not good. But if I click it, it takes us to the actual news article itself. And now we're on the Fox Business website. So this is really starting to look like a fully working application here, but I need to be able to go from page to page. I don't want the users to have to click manually inside of the URL and set the page to 2. I want there to be a paginator at the bottom so that they can click on the different pages and go to the page that they want to be on. So we're going to create a paginator at the bottom of this feed component. So going back into the component, if you highlight inside of main, we're going to go below main. But in order to go below main, we're going to have a container for this. So I'm going to cut this and add a div with a class name of page container and paste the main back inside of here. And below main is where our paginator is going to go. So I'm going to throw in another div, class name equal to styles.paginator. Okay, so we have the paginator div. What do we want to add in here? If you remember, there was 3 things inside of there. There was previous page that we could click on to go to the previous page. In the middle was the page number itself. And then on the right was next page. So we could click it and go to the next page. So in that order, if we go ahead and start entering this in, we can start with the previous page. So throw in a div here, the class name. This is going to be dynamic because if we're on page 1, we don't want to allow the user to click on that and go to page 0. We want to gray it out and disallow anybody from clicking on it. So if page is 1, so if page number is 1, we're going to use a ternary operator here. Page is 1. Then we're going to want to add the styles.disabled class. Otherwise, we're going to say styles.active. So we're doing styles.active if the page number is not 1. Otherwise, we're doing styles.disabled if it is. But we also need to have an on-click event here. And in this on-click event, we want to make sure that we do not run if the page number is 1. So if the page number is greater than 1, then we can run some logic. Otherwise, we're just not going to run anything at all. But what is it we want to run whenever we click on previous page? It's pretty simple. we need to import the router. So let's go ahead and import the router. And we've already imported the router in the toolbar, so you should be somewhat familiar with what that looks like. I'm importing it from Next router. And then at the top of my component, I need to set the router variable, just like this, const router equals use router. So I have the router now. And what I want to do is say router.push, and I want to go to /feed, and then whatever the page number is, -1. So I'm using this string interpolation here to do that. These are the backticks here. And where I want to inject my JavaScript is right here, page number -1. So if we're on page 3, if I click this, we're going to go to /feed /page 3 -1, which is 2. All right. So we have the onClick and we have the class name for it. We just want to add the text. So in between the opening and closing tag here, I'm just going to say previous page, click save, and let's go to the component and see what this looks like here at the bottom. So at the bottom here, I have this, this previous page thing right here. Now I'm on page 2. What do you think is going to happen when I click on it? I clicked on it. It brought us to page 1. Now what happens if I click on it again? Nothing happens. And that's great because we're on page 1 and we don't want to go to the previous page if we're on page 1 because there is no previous page. However, there's a couple of things that's going on here that I don't like. One is the styles looks terrible. So we can go ahead and knock out the styles in a second. And the other thing is when I clicked on previous page, it didn't scroll back up to the top and that didn't feel right. So Next.js is aware of this. It's not really a problem. They don't consider it a bug. They want us to handle it ourselves, which is fine, we can do, but they are actually going to add this as the automatic behavior in the future. So if you're watching this in the future, it might not do that. But if you are watching this and it is doing that, the way to fix that is to go to where we are routing, and route.push actually is a promise. If I hover over push, you can see that it returns a promise of type Boolean. So that means we can call then on it. And so I'll call .then, and whenever we finish routing, I'm gonna set window.scroll to 0, 0. And when I save that, if I go back to say page 2, scroll down, click on previous page, it goes to the previous page and then sets the scroll back to the top, which is the behavior that I think seems more intuitive. So let's start by making this paginator look a little bit better before we add the other pieces. So jump into your feed.module.css file, go to the bottom, and let's start adding a couple of classes. We have a paginator class. Actually, we're only gonna, we'll add a few classes. So we'll start with a width, and I wanna set the width of the actual paginator to be 100%. Then the display, I'm gonna do flex. And finally, we're gonna justify the content to center so that everything is centered inside of it horizontally. Now let's target each individual div inside of the paginator, set the margin for each of these to 25 pixels, okay? And then now we're gonna have the active and disabled class. So inside of paginator, we're gonna target the disabled class first and set the cursor to be not allowed. And we want to set the color to be this like grayed out color so that it's more obvious that you can't click it. So I'm doing RGB 179, 179, 179. Now in the case of active, we're just going to override that by putting it above it. So make sure it's above disabled because CSS goes down in order. We want to set the active case to cursor pointer, and we will just set the, we will not set the color. It'll just be the default color if it's active. So going back down here, as you can see, since I'm on page 1, it's grayed out, and the cursor is that not allowed thing. It's very obvious that I'm not allowed to click this. Super cool. So back to the feed, I'm going to add the page number in the middle. So that's the second piece to this paginator. So going over here underneath this div, but still inside of the paginator, we'll add another div, which I will go ahead and put a number sign. And then we want to, in JavaScript, put in page number. So let's save that, see what that looks like. Now we have both the previous page and the page number. If I go to page 2, you can see that now previous page is enabled and active, and instead of page number 1, we see number 2. The final piece of this was the next page button, which is going to be very, very similar to the previous page button. So I'm actually going to copy the previous page div here, go underneath the page number div, paste this in. Instead of previous, I want this to say next, and the check here is going to be slightly different. Instead of saying greater than 1, we want to check if it's equal to 5. Because if the page number is equal to 5, instead of checking for greater than 1, we want to check for greater than 5. Actually, we want to check for less than 5. So if the page number is less than 5, then we can go to the next page, because if it's not less than 5, we don't want to go past page 5 in our application here. So instead of also doing page number -1, since we're going to the next page, we're going to say page number +1, and then just make sure that we're scrolling to the top here. Now, in the case of the class name, we want to, instead of checking if it's equal to 1, check if it's equal to 5. So let's go ahead, save that, and go into our feed and see what we end up with. So I'm on page 2. If I scroll down, you can see we have previous page, the page number is 2, and we have next page. So I click it and now I'm on page 3. That works. Page 4, that works. Page 5, now I'm on page 5. If I scroll all the way down, you can see that next page is disabled. I cannot click that. This says page 5, that's good. If I go to page 1, you can see that the previous page button is disabled and I can't click that. So all that's left on this page is to be able to add the toolbar. So let's add the toolbar really quick, which is very simple. We can copy the import from the EOM page and paste it in at the top here of our feed page. And then of course, inside of page container and outside of main, go ahead and add in your toolbar tag, save, and I'm gonna click refresh. Okay, this is saying, okay, and the reason why this is breaking is because we're actually one more directory in because we're inside of a feed folder. So we need to add one more set of dots here in our import. Now, if I save it and refresh, it's working good. I've got my toolbar here at the top. So I can go to the home page, I can go to the feed, and I can see employee of the month. So this app is pretty much done now. You have a fully working Next.js application. However, what I want to do is show you how to deploy this to Vercel and then show you some of the benefits of our server-side rendering when trying to post to certain social media websites. So with that being said, let's go ahead and push our project to GitHub. So what you'll want to do is go to wherever you have your project in your terminal or, command line interface, and make sure you're in the directory and run git add. Now, it should have already created a Git repository for you when you ran create next app. So it already has a repository set up for you. So all you have to do is just make sure you commit your code. So just run, git add dot, just your standard Git stuff. This isn't a Git tutorial, so I'm going to assume you know how to use Git. So I did git add. And now I've staged all my changes. And now I'm just gonna commit my changes really quick. So git commit -m, and I'm just gonna say init, because this is the initial commit. Now I'm gonna check git branch just to see what branch I'm on, and I'm on the main branch. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna push this out to GitHub. So what you're gonna wanna do is go to GitHub, create a new repository, call it, whatever you want. I would make sure that it's called Next News just so that it matches. Push this out there. So if you need to do a basic tutorial on Git, if you want to move forward, that's perfectly fine, but I would expect you probably at least know how to use GitHub. Go ahead and push this repository out to GitHub and then resume this tutorial once you've done that. So I've got my GitHub repository right here. I would expect you to now have a GitHub repository with all of your code inside of it just like this. So with that being said, what we're gonna do now is go to Vercel. So go to vercel.com and you'll go ahead and sign up. Now go ahead and sign up. Again, it's completely free, no payment information required. Go ahead and sign up for Vercel and go to your dashboard. Now on your dashboard, click New Project. And what we will do is we're gonna import a Git repository. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this link right here. It says missing Git repository, adjust GitHub app permissions. And in my case, I need to explicitly go in and give access to Vercel to access this repository. So I'm scrolling down here and I'm going to add this Next News repository. So I'm searching for Next and you can see port exe/Next News is there. And I'm gonna click save. So now Vercel has access to that repository. And since it now has access, I can click this import button next to Next News. And you can notice that it detected the fact that it was a Next.js application. Vercel is the company that oversees Next.js. So this is the platform you would likely want to publish your Next.js app to in the first place. So click import. I'm gonna click on the personal account here because I don't have a pro account. So just click on your personal account. I'm gonna let it stay Next News. You can name this whatever you want. But now we have to go down to our build and output settings. My apologies, the environment variables. Because we created an environment variable inside of our app to host our API key. You're gonna wanna add these environment variables here now. So go into where you added your environment variables in that .env file. If I go over to the left here, you can see inside of this .env file, go ahead and click that and go back here to this environment variables screen. I'll zoom in a little bit for you. And you're gonna wanna add in that next public news key as the name, and then the value is gonna be your actual API key. So go ahead and add in that value really quick, and then click add, and then we'll move forward. Now that I've added that, you can see that we have this environment variable called next public news key with an encrypted value. Cool. So all you have to do now is go ahead and click deploy. This is going to run a deploy process that will take a few minutes to probably run. And I'm going to go ahead and resume once it's completed on my end. So as soon as that completed, I was presented with this screen right here, and it says, congratulations, it's been deployed. Now on the left here, I can actually see a screenshot of the actual website, which makes me feel like it's promising that it's actually working, because that is what it looks like. So if I go and hover over this visit button, I can click it, and now you can see I am on the actual website. This is where your app now lives on the internet. Now it's called nextnewsflax.vercel.app. It'll probably be called something different on your end, obviously, a different URL, but let's just make sure this whole thing works. So if I click feed, I in fact see a news feed. I can go to the next page. I can go to employee of the month, and I see the employee of the month data right here. And Twitter brings me to my Twitter page. So this is a fully deployed Next.js app working. Very, very easy to get this thing running up and in production. Now, this is where we get to show you some really cool stuff. Now, this can be considered part of some extracurricular activities and stuff. I really just wanted to show you that this works, but if you want to see this work in action for yourself, you can do it for yourself. But I added some extra code that I'm going to show you right now that I did not show in the earlier part of the tutorial. You can add it yourself, but again, I just really wanted to show you how this works. So I'm going to go to my pages. Let's go to the employee of the month page. I imported head from next/head, which is just included automatically as part of the main Next.js library. And I'm using this head tag. Now, what is this doing? Well, it allows me to add headers into my HTML document, just like you would be able to add headers in a static HTML document. But it allows us to add headers that are actually injected into the actual source document itself, which means that these will be present whenever a Google bot or a social media bot parses this web page. And I'm setting the standard meta tags that we would expect to add in a good SEO app, or an app that we would want to have a preview for if we're sharing the link on, say, Twitter or Facebook or something like that. So I'm adding these tags in and then populating it dynamically with the data that I've gotten from this employee object, which means that we're having dynamic data set into the header on the server. And what this ends up allowing us to do is be able to customize what this information is going to look like when we share it on something like Facebook, for example. So I've gone over to this Facebook for Developers debugger tool at developers.facebook.com/tools/debug, and I've pasted in my link and ran the scraper. And you can see that when I've done that, now it knows what to show when I share this link on Facebook. So this is what the link preview would look like. It says employee of the month, and this is for the specifically for the employee of the month route. It shows employee of the month, and then there's a small description underneath it that says this month's employee of the month is port.exe, and it shows the image. If I didn't have all of that information in there, if this wasn't server-side rendered, if this was a standard React app, this would look empty. It would try to pull some information, but it would only have that skeleton available for it. It wouldn't have all this data from the database. It wouldn't really know what to show. So this is really powerful. All right, well, I certainly hope you enjoyed this tutorial. You built a Next.js application and you deployed this thing to a production environment with server-side rendering. Great job. Now, if you did enjoy this video, please like this video, subscribe so you don't miss any future tutorials, and I'll see you all in the next video.